Hi, we're talking about the kernel Blotto game. What I'm going to do in this very brief lecture is talk about its wider applicability. So remember, one of the reasons that we construct models is that they're often incredibly fertile. So we can take a model that we use for one reason and apply it in other settings. So we saw some extreme examples of this with the Markov process, right? We develop a Markov process for a particular reason, and we can use it for figuring out whether drug protocols work, and we can even use it to figure out who wrote a particular book. Here what we're going to do is we're going to use sort of a more direct application. So we've got this Blotto idea, which is troops on fronts. So it had military origins. But what we're going to see is that same model can be used in other contexts to help us understand other forms of competition. So I guess what I'm going to do in this lecture is just go through some other examples where, in my opinion anyway, Blotto applies. So again, let's remind ourselves what Blotto is. You've got two players. Each one has some set of troops that they have to allocate across some fronts. Their action is just, how do I allocate my troops across those fronts? And then we determine the winner by looking front by front to see who had the most troops. Whoever had the most troops wins the game. Very straightforward. So it's clear that that works for a military battle, where each one of us is sort of lining up our troops along these fronts, and whoever has the most troops, if you have more troops here, you win. So it's clear that it works in the military setting. But does it apply elsewhere? What I'm going to convince you is yes. So here's the first example, the U.S. Electoral College. So to be president of the United States, you don't have to win the most votes. What you have to do is win the most states. What you can think of is you can think of each state as a front. So you've got Colorado as a front, Michigan's a front, Florida's a front, and increasingly Ohio's a front. So what you have to do if you're running for president, you've got to decide, where do I allocate my quote-unquote troops? Now what are troops here? Troops are money. So each candidate has some set of money that they can use for hiring volunteers, running television and radio ads, running rallies. They've also got, troops can also be their personal time. Where do they spend time? So if you think about how political candidates spend time, there's some states, like recently California, even though it's got the most votes, hasn't been in play for the Republican candidate. And so therefore, since the Republicans know the Democrats are going to win, neither candidate even campaigns there. So they don't put any troops there. So you can think of the Electoral College game as just one big game of Blotto, where each person's trying to decide where to allocate troops. So you have some elections, like the contested election between Bush and Gore, where at the last minute, George Bush went and put a whole bunch of troops in Tennessee, which was Gore's home state. Gore hadn't put many troops in Tennessee because he thought for sure he'd win it, and it turns out that then Bush won Tennessee, costing Gore the election. So this Electoral College game is a lot like a game of Blotto. And how do you win? Well, you have more troops, more money, more resources, and you strategically outthink the other person, figuring out where should I allocate my troops just so I can edge out the other person in that campaign. Terrorism is another example. If you think of terrorism, there's a whole bunch of places where a terrorist organization could attack. So what the government has to do is the government has to then somehow put constraints on them, to put troops, resources in places to prevent terrorist activities from taking place. So you can think of all these possible fronts: airports, train stations, bus stations, stadiums, financial services systems, water systems, all sorts of things. So there's a whole set of fronts, and they've got to decide, the government does, how do we allocate our resources so we can stop the terrorists? Now here it's slightly different maybe than Blotto in the sense that the terrorists might not need to win every front. They might only need to win one front. Now you can think, well, that's going to be easy. Well, it may not be easy because the fact is the government has a lot more resources than the terrorist group has. And in fact, if the government knows exactly how many resources the terrorist group has, they can put exactly enough resources on each front to prevent them from being successful. Let's take something else. Let's take trials. Suppose you've got two lawyers going at each other. Would Blotto work there? Well, it's not actually a very bad approximation. So who are the players? The players are the prosecution and the defense, the two lawyers. And then you think, what are the fronts? Well, the fronts could be lines of defense or lines of prosecution. So you've got to sit there and think, okay, these are the ways this case could get played out. Now, in preparing for this case, the lawyers have to decide, how much time do I spend on each of those lines of defense? And the point is, if I don't spend much time on one of them and my opponent does, I could lose that argument. And whoever wins the most arguments may win the case. Now again, it's not a perfect match, but it's close. And so you think about, boy, my lawyer really outsmarted the other lawyer. Well, did she? Or did she just happen to have put her troops on the right fronts, given where the other lawyer had put his troops? Even hiring, it's interesting, when I talk to people about hiring, I often find that hiring looks a lot like Blotto. Because what happens? You get a bunch of employees and you're trying to decide, who do we hire? Let's suppose that we've just got two applicants. And you look at their resumes and you see, okay, they've got education, they've got work experience, they've got maybe some set of skills, maybe they've got interviewing skills, they've got technical skills, interviewing skills. And what you can do is for each person, you can write down a number for their education level, their work experience, their strategic skills, their technical skills, their interviewing skills, whatever. And then you compare them one by one. It becomes almost like a game of Blotto for this position. You decide what the fronts are, which are the skills you want the person to have for the job, and then you compare people one by one. So it's like a game of Blotto. And the winner isn't necessarily someone who's better, who has more ability. It could be the person who just happens to have the right troops, so to speak, the right abilities relative to the other person. Finally, sports. Think of sports. Think of two people playing tennis, or people wrestling or boxing or something like that. You can think of there being many fronts or many dimensions on which the game is played. So let's take tennis. There's serving, there's return of serve, there's volley, there's net play, ground strokes, all sorts of stuff. Each one of those is like a front. You can think of a player's ability as being their skills on each of those fronts. Now, if I dominate you, if my return of serve is really good and your serve is weak, that means I'm going to win on that front. And whoever wins on the most fronts may be likely to win the match. This could explain why some players have an advantage against others. Like, so maybe player A can beat B and B can beat C, but then C in turn can beat A, because of the fact that it isn't just person of higher ability. In fact, it's the case that you see cycles because of the fact that it really is a game of Blotto. So what have we learned? We've learned that Blotto, which was developed for warfare, we're putting troops on fronts, applies to a whole bunch of different stuff. It applies to the electoral college, to terrorism, to trials, to sports, even to hiring decisions. And we can get insights from Blotto to all those different environments. We've already seen from Blotto that any position can be beaten by someone else. We've also seen that you don't need all your troops to win. What we're going to do in the next lecture is see how much of an advantage it is to really have more troops, and what you should do if you're at a disadvantage, if you don't have all those troops. Okay, thanks.